We got a good old-fashioned Grandmaster rating battle going on right now on chess.com, and it's between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. The two of them are vying to see who can be the highest-rated Blitz player on the website. And for those of you that haven't seen the news, the Play Magnus group was actually recently acquired by chess.com, and what that means is we're going to be seeing the world champion spending a lot more time playing some Blitz on chess.com, and this is a space that's typically been dominated by Hikaru Nakamura. Nakamura has obviously been the #1 Blitz player there for quite a long time, and by a lot. So all of a sudden, though, he's got some very stiff competition, and I was very fortunate to be able to watch one of these matches. I just happened to be streaming yesterday when Magnus Carlsen was playing against Vidit. Vidit, of course, being a 2700 plus rated Grandmaster from India, very strong, very good at Blitz, and the two of them were going head to head, and they played a 15-game match. Now, I have to spoil a little bit just for all of this to make sense, but during the match, Magnus Carlsen actually became the highest rated Blitz player on the site, but that is not the end of the story, because since then, sometime in the last 12 hours or so, Hikaru Nakamura must have been playing a little bit of Blitz, because all of a sudden you can see he is now #1 again, and he's 3249 rated compared to 2 points less, 3247 for Magnus Carlsen. But you can also see this huge gap in between #2 and #3. It's about 150 rating points. So you can see these two top dogs are really far ahead of the rest of the pack in terms of rating. Now, if you do want to check out the entire match, I will be posting the whole thing on the Vampire Chicken channel. This is my second channel, for those of you that don't know. Please go and subscribe to it. I got a lot of other really fun chess content, a lot of Blitz games and that sort of stuff. I also got some other fun games and whatever. It's just my whatever channel. I play Risk, I play other games. So if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in, please check out the Vampire Chicken channel. Make sure you subscribe. All right, but first, let's get back. Let's get back to this game. And I actually got two games for you. I got a bonus game and a little bonus story. But let's jump into this. And let's talk about this really cool weapon that you can play against the Sicilian Defense. So after e4, c5, the first surprise that you can use to kind of take your opponents off guard is this really strange looking move, pawn to a3. And this has the idea of potentially playing some sort of delayed wing gambit. You're playing this because you want to play b4 next, and then you're hoping that black kind of takes away from the center, and you can play d4, you get a very strong center. This is the main idea. Now, in the Masters database, you will find that g6 is the most common way for players to guard against this. And it has the point that knowing that white is about to play pawn to b4, you want to be able to get your bishop on this diagonal before white has the opportunity of getting a bishop to b2, for example. Okay, so you want to get your bishop over there. g6 makes a ton of sense. But here, instead of playing pawn to b4, you can play surprise number 2, bloom, pawn to h4. And this is kind of a really cool, interesting idea that you can play as white. And the idea is I'm going to be playing h5, and then potentially at some point when it's possible, I might even push this guy all the way to h6 and not let this bishop be able to get developed. So in this game, we saw knight to f6 being played, and now white followed up with pawn to e5. And this asks the black knight a very interesting question, because if you do just hop to the center, for example, which might look very logical, white might be able to get a very good position after just simply pushing with pawn to h5. And I won't get into too many of the details, but this is kind of allowing white to do exactly what they want. So in this game, we saw instead the knight go to h5, where it's just blocking the pawn so that white can't go through with the normal idea. Now, in this position, Magnus played this crazy move, pawn to b4, and I must tell you, the computer absolutely hates this. The computer's like, this is the worst pawn wing gambit that I've ever seen in my life. You shouldn't be able to do this. But yet, we got such an interesting position that I really wanted to show you this game. But before we come back and we look at pawn to b4, I do need to tell you a little bit of how Magnus may have learned this opening from another player. Because back in 2021, last year in the Meltwater finals of that tournament, which is the online 15-minute Magnus Carlsen tournament, we also got this same exact position, only this time it was Mamedyarov with the white pieces taking on Magnus, and Mamedyarov actually was able to defeat Magnus with this opening. So let's first talk about this Mamedyarov game that taught this opening to Magnus, and then how Magnus used this and was able to win a blitz game. So here's how it went. It went the same exact way: knight to f6, e5, knight to h5, and now the game gets really fun. Now, instead of b4, which was Magnus's choice. We see Mamedyarov go for bishop to e2, attacking the knight on h5 and just threatening to take it. So Magnus played knight to f7, attacking the bishop, keeping some eye on g2, and white here just goes ahead and plays pawn to d4, and he's able to do this. He's able to open up his bishop, attack this knight, because the g2 pawn is not actually attacked. If you were to take it, for example, white could just play king to f1, and all of a sudden, this knight is trapped and out of the game, so that would just be a major mistake. So instead, black had to take this bishop, and after knight takes e2, we say c takes d4. Black is able to kind of start to destroy the center of the board. Well, now comes pawn to h5. White is not bothering to even take this pawn back. I'm going to be able to win this at some other moment, but let me just try to get my main idea, which is pawn to h5. This is exactly what white is trying to do. So now comes bishop to g7, and there's no time for h6 yet because this e-pawn is attacked, but after f4, white really is threatening to play pawn to h6, and now this is something where black, Magnus Carlsen, needs to be making a very difficult decision, and the way that he came up with to avoid pawn to h6 was to simply take on h5, and now, obviously, there's a lot of different ways that white might try to take back one of these pawns, but he decides on knight takes d4, and now comes pawn to d6, and black is continuing to chip away at the center here. So a very strong move, pawn to d6, and obviously we need to be worried about the pawn capturing, so white comes up with pawn to e6, giving up another pawn, but some ideas that if you are to ever capture this way, maybe we'll be able to take on h5 with our queen, delivering a check that might be very disruptive for black. And even if you are to take with your bishop, we might have ideas of taking, and then taking back on h5 with the queen, delivering the same kind of check. So what we saw in the game was queen to a5, and after we got out of check, now we decide to, at this moment, take with the bishop. So in this way, in some line where we do get this sort of capture, followed by this check is going to be defended against. And that's what black has defended against with all these moves. But you've also now allowed the rook to take on h5 to gain a tempo on the queen. And this guy, keep an eye on the rook on h5. He's going to play a very integral role, and he's going to do some very strange things in this game, as we will see. Now, the black queen goes back to b6, putting some pressure on this b pawn, but white here does have the time to play bishop to e3 and protect the knight, which is attacked by the queen and the bishop. And the black queen does not have the option of taking on b2. This is something that obviously can be very risky, and here, in fact, the queen would just simply be trapped. Notice how the knights are defending all of the escape squares for the queen, so something like this would just be a massive queen blunder. So that's not what we saw in this game. We saw instead knight to c6, and black is putting all of this pressure, as much pressure as possible, on the d4 square, and this knight is now attacked for a third time. So how is white going to get out of it? Rook to b5, using that rook in order to kick the queen away so that there's no more pressure on d4. So the queen has to back away. And now we see this capture on e6. And after, if this recapture, again, whenever this recapture happens, we're going to be expecting queen to h5, and then white is going to be able to castle. So that's the main idea, which black now has an option of whether or not to take on c3 first. And black does exercise this option, breaking up the pawn structure, which then whenever white inevitably castles on the queen side, he's going to have a worse structure. So f takes e6, the queen does come in for the check, the king goes to d7, and now it's up to white to come up with some sort of way of trying to break down the center. Like at some point, we're probably going to get castled. At some point, we might want to consider c4, c5, or maybe we can just continue with this move, pawn to f5, just trying to open up the king as much as possible. Knight to e8 is what was played by Magnus. The knight is covering a lot of the important light squares in the position, but now white has the opportunity to get castled. And this is where the game is already getting very complicated, but a lot of the tactics might favor white in this position. And black decides to play rook to f8. Now, I just want to highlight some of the potential dangers that do await for black, because there are some very nice tactics to give you kind of an idea of what I'm talking about. Like, for example, let's say black got very greedy and decided this is a great pawn to attack, and then plus maybe my queen is attacking your bishop and threatening some sort of checks. This looks like this could be a very fascinating variation for black, but as it turns out, this allows white a very interesting option of taking on e6, and if knight takes e6, white would have some absolutely amazing tactics. Now, you can pause if you want to figure out what you would play here as white, but I'm just going to go ahead and give it away. And I will tell you, it is not rook takes b7. It is instead rook takes d6. This is the kind of move that white would be looking to play in a position like this, where if you were to take back with a king, you wouldn't want to do that. You were just going to end up getting checkmated. And if instead you were going to take with a pawn, which looks like a lot more normal, all of a sudden you're going to be hit with queen to f7, where we still have all of these attacks on these pieces, and something like this is actually crushing for white, who now has defended this bishop. We're attacking all of your pawns. Something like this, even though black is up material, will just be a winning position for white. So that's the kind of things that black needs to be on guard for. And black decides to try to resolve this tension by bringing the rook to f8. Now comes this fantastic move, exploiting this pin. And again, we're seeing this rook who did a little bit of magic. He's coming back to continue to do some pretty amazing things in this game, exploiting the pin on the d file, attacking the queen, defending the pawn. And here, Magnus Carlsen actually makes a very large mistake by taking with the queen. And I'm thinking during the game, Magnus must have just expected that white would take back. Like, after all, the queen's hanging, you're just going to be taking the queen, right? And then black would have some ideas of winning some material back. But instead of just taking the queen right away, white can first insert this very important move. And because of this, all of a sudden, you're in a lot of trouble. Because now if here, you are able to play bishop takes c5, and no longer do you have this option. We would just be able to take your rook. So because of that, all of a sudden now, Magnus is completely lost. And instead of taking right away on e6 with the knight, he takes with the king. He gets to this lost position. Now, we'll speed through this just a little bit. But as you can see, a very nice way of trading the rooks here, played by white, and they got to some position where now, after the attack has kind of gone away, and this pawn is so strong, Magnus Carlsen had to resign. And that is what brings us to this game against Vidit that was just played last night. And in this game, we get to this same very position where we see pawn to h4, and after knight to f6, e5, kicking the knight, but instead of bishop to e2, he plays pawn to b4. This is the Magnus Carlsen way of playing this position, and this is probably actually extra dubious, but it did really work out well in the game. So black here needs to be careful. Like, you don't actually really want to be taking something like this, which will allow white to play pawn to d4 and support the center. Instead, he plays pawn to d6, and he's just trying to undermine this pawn, and he's going to at some point be able to get this bishop on g7, where it's going to be roaring down this diagonal. So now comes e takes d6, but now bishop to g7. Black doesn't even bother taking back or anything, and instead decides to target the rook. Now, at some point, we're obviously going to need to block, potentially with knight to c3, but first Magnus decides to deliver this check. He plays bishop to b5, and after bishop to d7, he trades right here, allowing black to determine how you want to recapture. Black took back with a queen, and now comes knight to c3. White needs to do something in order to guard this diagonal. And for now, white is actually a pawn up. But as you can see, there's a lot of tension between the pawns in this position. And black decides to grab the d pawn. And now comes knight to f3. White is able to get some stuff out. Black is able to get castled. White is able to get castled. And this is the interesting middle game that we are going to be getting now. Black here plays knight to d7 in order to continue to develop the pieces. Rook to b1, getting off of this long diagonal. Now comes pawn to b6, and material here is equal. And we just have an interesting, weird middle game. That's just kind of like what we got going on. The knight comes to e4. Queen goes over to c6, attacking the knight. Rook to e1, defending the knight. Rook a to d8. Now comes b takes c5. Pawn takes back. Pawn to d3, and it's just a weird, wacky, interesting structure. Knight comes to b6, and now a very interesting choice, something that this is the kind of move that I think would be very difficult for most of us to play, but it actually turns out to be a pretty interesting idea, and it's this idea of playing the queen to d2, a very weird, mysterious move, but potentially this queen now, how are you going to, if you're just focused on the targets in the position, how is the queen going to come into the game? Well, maybe all of a sudden white would be playing something like queen to a5, and you can kind of get the idea that the players are really just kind of of focused on where are the weaknesses and how can I attack them. Whenever you get these kind of weird structures where everything's kind of all over the place, they do an excellent job of identifying where they should be putting all of their pieces. So c4 is a way of trying to get rid of one of these weak pawns, but now comes d4, e5, and black is exploiting some of this tension here in the center, but the queen still is coming over to a5, and now we see this capture in the center, and white is taking on a7, and all of a sudden we get this fascinating position where black has this very strong looking central position, but there's a lot of stuff still going on. Knight to a4 is what we saw played in the game, and now rook to b4, attacking this knight. We can see how they just kind of identify what can you possibly attack. Well, maybe you can attack the knight, and this is going to force black to bring a rook all the way back to a8. Now comes queen to e7, rook to f8, and here, I believe, is where white actually makes a very large mistake. Now, the way that white should play this position, there's actually only one move, and it's to bring the queen back to b7, and the idea here is that if you do make this trade, we are going to see some sort of position like this, where all of a sudden we're going to have certain targets. Like I'm trying to remember exactly what the computer said. Like we're going to be able to, you know, make some sort of targets against these pawns that are very difficult for black to find. So I'm turning on the engine here, and I'm putting it on. If white is able to play knight to d6, it becomes very difficult for black to defend everything. So what we saw instead, though, in this position right here, after the queen got attacked, unfortunately for white, they played queen to d6, and now there's going to be a series of trades, and one of the problems is this tension that's going on the e file, because now after queen takes d6, knight takes d6, rook takes e1, the knight is forced to go back. But worse than that is all of a sudden in this exact position, black has a very strong move, and that move is bishop to f8, exploiting this the fact that this knight is pinned to the rook, and how the rook doesn't have a good way of coming back to defend the knight. So, all of a sudden, Magnus is going to be losing material. So he decides to try to give it up in the best way possible. He takes on c4 and offers the exchange this way. So now, it's a bishop and pawn for a rook, so obviously black now is doing fantastic and should just be winning this game, but Magnus Carlsen is very tough, especially in blitz, and all throughout the match, there was a very noticeable time difference. Vidit was always in much more time pressure than Magnus Carlsen, and that's something that was kind of emphasized in this game as well. Knight came into c3. We see the king start to run in. Bishop comes to b2, and at some moment here, we see white going after this pawn, which he's now going to be able to take. So he takes on d4, knight takes, bishop takes, and now black needs to make a decision as to which pawn to recapture, and he decides to take this one, which may be fine, but I think all of a sudden, if white is able to kind of get it so all of the pawns are just on this one side of the board, maybe there's some potential for fortresses, especially in blitz, when it's not so easy to come up with a lot of great ideas very quickly. But how now? The c-pawn is under attack. What is he going to do? Well, he's able to push the pawn. It is defended by the knight. After this knight moves away, we see this structure emerging. Now the bishop is attacked. Bishop's got to move away. And at some point, black is trying to kick the knight away in order to be able to win this c-pawn. So the knight goes here, and all of a sudden there's another target. We're able to put pressure on this f-pawn. So after f5, the knight is able to give a check. He's able to win this guy. And Magnus gets to a position where he's very close to being able to have some sort of fortress by being able to trade the pawns. It's now not very obvious at all how black is going to be able to make any progress. And from here, this probably should just be some sort of draw, but obviously it's blitz and like a lot of crazy things can happen. But when I was watching this live, the thing that really stood out was just somehow, by sheer magic, we get to some position like this. This is now in the table base. This is a drawn position, but it just felt like the entire time white just kept making progress. He's able to win this pawn, and very slowly, bit by bit, inch by inch, he's just able to move the pawns. They just keep coming. It's white that just keeps making progress, and this again should always be a draw, but it was fantastic. It's just somehow one guy slowly, the pawns are going slowly. Every single move, it's just like they just keep going, and then with almost no time left, black hangs a rook, and Magnus is able to win the game. So I thought this was a fascinating opening. I don't know. You can let me know. Is this something that you would play? Would you play A3 and H4? I don't know. Maybe it's not great. Maybe the computer doesn't like it, but maybe you do. You can let me know in the comments below. And if you like it, please make sure you subscribe. Check out the second channel because you can see the entire match. Okay, bye.
If you're feeling trapped like a queen, no blunders, only sacrifice and see. Well, you may have the blues. Never be a chicken when you lose.